this video, I'm going to be showing you some of the basics of using Desmos, a free online graphing calculator. And we'll be using this together in our calculus course. So in order to get started, you want to first arrive at desmos.com, and then you can either get started with the graphing calculator by clicking this button right here in the middle of the page, or you could also find that under Math Tools, Graphing Calculator. Now, after clicking that button, Graphing Calculator, you'll see a Cartesian plane over here where your graph or graphs will appear. And you see this area over here on your left where you can enter in the functions that you'd like to see graphed. Now, there's two different ways of doing that. And the easiest way, perhaps, is just to use the keyboard. So if I were interested in plotting something like the cosine of x, I can just go ahead and type COS for cosine, parentheses of x, and Desmos understands that I would like to see a mathematical cosine curve graphed for me just by typing in the letters COS. So you now see that cosine curve appearing in the Cartesian plane. You can also see that Desmos has tried to be helpful. It has added in some of these gray points along the cosine curve that might be of importance to us. And if you hover over those points, it shows you those specific values. If you don't want to type directly from the keyboard and you're looking for something that looks a little bit more like an actual graphing calculator, we also have this button down here in the lower left, which says Show Keypad when you hover over it. You could also click on that and it will pop up something that looks more like an actual physical calculator that has variables like x and y. It has the option to do powers and square roots and these less than or equal to, greater than or equal to symbols, and more. If you had wanted to type in the function cosine of x and didn't want to use the keyboard, you would have been able to find that under this functions button, where it would have trig functions for you, inverse trig functions, and all sorts of other things you can explore, including calculus terms. To make this functions keypad go away, just click on the functions button again. And to make the keypad go away, click on hide keypad. Now, on a standard graphing calculator, you also have the ability to change the window of the graph that you might see. And if that's something that you wish to replicate on Desmos, there are a couple of ways to handle that as well. The first is to use these plus and minus buttons to zoom in or out. So if I had wanted to zoom in, maybe more on this region just from -6 to 6 of my cosine curve, I could try zooming in, and then I can come and click inside this Cartesian plane and move my mouse around to change what's in my viewing window at that time. However, this can create a little bit of a problem for me because although I can get the 6 over here on the right, I don't quite reach the 6 over on the left-hand side of the window through any amount of dragging. And the minute that I zoom back out, my window is larger than I want it to see. So what I'm going to recommend next doesn't really eliminate that problem necessarily. But what I can do is I can say, maybe just don't graph all of the cosine of x curve. Maybe what I want to do is just graph the portion of it from over here around -6 to 6. And I'm being a little bit imprecise. I don't actually want to look at my cosine curve from -6 to +6. I'm rounding. Maybe what I really want to do is look at that cosine curve from -2 pi to +2 pi. In order to achieve that, I can change what I type in over here to tell Desmos that I'd like to limit the domain of my function to only be from -2 pi to +2 pi. But that's going to take a little bit of syntax or computer language. So in order to limit the domain of the function, I'm going to have to change the way that I've typed this in. What I'd like to look at is the cosine of x, but only as my x values range from -2 pi to 2 pi. So I need some way of specifying that to the computer. The way that we're going to make this work in Desmos is we're going to ultimately put braces around the cosine of x. So braces are those squiggly brackets on your keypad. And what we're going to do is we're going to write in the format of the window that we want to see, followed by the function we want to see graphed with a colon separating those things. So what I want to see is x values that are in between -2 pi and positive 2 pi. And the function I want to see is the cosine of x function. So again, the syntax here is I need these braces surrounding everything I want graphed. On the left-hand side of the colon, I'd like the domain in which I want my x values to fall, negative 2 pi to 2 pi. And on the right of the colon, I'd like the function that I want to see graphed within that domain. That's the syntax that I need to use in order for Desmos to understand what I would like graphed. And now if you notice over here on the right, I haven't quite solved the window problem, but what I have done is made it so that all that is graphed is my cosine function within this restricted domain. While sometimes we might want to graph a function within a restricted domain, other times we might want to graph a function within a restricted range. So let's now add to our picture a second function that we want graphed, and instead of restricting the domain of that function, or the x values we want to consider, let's restrict the range of that function, or the y values that we want to consider. So the function that I'd like to add to this mix is the function e to the x. And Desmos does understand if I just type the letter e that I'm talking about that mathematical constant e, 2.71828, and so on. And you can see that when you type in an e right here. But I'd like to look at the function e to the x. So all I did at my keyboard is typed the letter e, used that caret sign above the 6 on the keyboard, and then typed the letter x. And it has now graphed e to the x for me in my Cartesian plane. And I'd like to add a restriction here to the output values, or the y values that I'm considering. And so I'll need to use the syntax similar to what I used when I was restricting the domain of the cosine function. I'm going to need to add in braces surrounding my function. I will need my restricted range to fall to the left of a colon. And the function for which I'd like to see on that restricted range needs to be to the right of the colon. But since it's not the x values that I'm restricting, it's the y values that I'm restricting, that's what I need to type on the left of the colon. So let's imagine that I only want to see values of the function e to the x that are greater than 1. I can type in 1 is less than y on the other side of this colon, and that will almost accomplish what I need. You can see that I've followed the same syntax for my second function that I followed for the first function, and yet I no longer see that blue function being graphed in the Cartesian plane on the right-hand side. And you also see this little triangle with an exclamation point in it, which is telling me that there's some sort of problem with what I've written. And in fact, if I hover over it, it tries to give me a suggestion. Try adding an equal sign to turn this into an equation. What Desmos is trying to communicate to me is that I've mixed two different letters here, and I'm not talking about the e. That's this mathematical constant. I've mixed x's and y's, and at this moment, Desmos isn't really sure what the y is. So in order to make this work with a restricted range, I need to add an equal sign telling Desmos what y is equal to. And so all I have to do is all the way on the left, before my first left brace, I need to type y is equal to this thing. And all of a sudden, Desmos understands now what the letter y means in this expression, that I'm using y for my output values, and it graphs this function for me with a restricted range.